Hey, Michelle, I'm here if you need support with anything. And once you're ready, I can start letting people in, or you can too.
Yeah, I agree. Great.
So welcome everybody. This is the Housing First training. I'm glad you all are here. We do this training every year. And so for some of you, you might think, why do I need this again? It's because Housing First is actually very, very important, as you will hear, both sort of on principle, but also for HUD. It's something that gets sort of looked at and is a very important part of the way we do our work. So I'm going to turn things over to home base. Just a quick reminder, we will be recording this. We will be providing a recording and the materials afterwards. And home base will tell you how they want to get questions and whatnot, but you can always ask questions in the chat and we'll try and answer them as well. With that, I will turn it over to home base.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Burns and I'm a directing analyst with Home Base. And I'm joined today by my colleague Eli, who I'll turn it over to in just a moment. And we're going to be presenting our Housing First training to you today. So I'll now turn it over to Eli just to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eli. I've gotten to know a bunch of you over the last month or so, but for those of you who haven't met yet, hello. It's lovely to be in this training with you. And I am also with Home Base and I'm going to be helping to facilitate the training.
Great. And then later, we will also be joined by our colleague Carly Devlin, as well as by Shelby and Jamie from H3, who are going to be working with us to in our breakout rooms. So what we're doing here today is going to be talking about, we're calling it Housing First 201, not 101. And this, as Jamie said, it's a training for the continuum of care, and it's really designed to both provide you with a little refresher on some housing first principles and why they're important, but then also to really spend some significant time in smaller groups to talk about actual scenarios and some of the real challenges that we all see in our day-to-day work around implementing housing first principles in service and housing provision. So this is an overview of what we'll be discussing today. We will be talking about the core principles and key characteristics of housing first programs. We'll be reviewing some common barriers to program enrollment and some common housing first challenges. And then we're going to really focus on implementation and, like I said earlier, how that plays out on the ground, and then spend some time looking forward in terms of how we can incorporate this into our work. A few things to keep in mind, we're all very used now, I think, to the Zoom world and participating in these trainings virtually. So just a couple reminders, everyone is on mute right now. You can have your cameras on or off. I would encourage you, have your camera on if you would like to, but also please take care of yourselves. This is, it is going to be a 2-hour training. We want you to be as comfortable and engaged as you can be. So whatever that means for you. And in terms of questions, definitely feel free to put things in the chat, and then we will be pausing at various points, and you can raise your hand if you would like to come off mute and ask a question. So just put the little raise hand function on. And with that, I'll just get right into the content here and talk about why are we talking about Housing First today? So if you could go to the next slide, please. Great. So yes, terrific. So why are we talking about Housing First? Well, it is, as many of you know, an evidence-based practice. So it's really considered a best practice that underlines all housing-focused services that are offered through the continuum of care. I will also be occasionally referring to it as the CoC. And again, that is the continuum of care in Contra Costa County that provides basically is the governing body overseeing the homeless service programs in the county. The other thing about Housing First is it is actually a state law. So since 2016, it's been a state law. It was passed through the California legislature, and it requires that all state-funded housing program adopt the core components of the Housing First model. It's also, we're seeing really a funder priority. So we see it reinforced through both local and state grant competitions and through the written standards through the local continuum of care. And it's also a community priority. This is something, again, as an evidence-based practice that is really something that is important to community service providers, as well as to, of course, the people that we are serving. And that is really the most important part about Housing First, is that it really integrating these principles really does help people. They're the most supportive for clients and ensuring that they can be successful. And communities that implement system-wide Housing First practices are also more cost-effective, more successful, and in general, just better serve people who are experiencing homelessness. So we can go to the next slide. Housing First at the system level. What does that look like? So if we're looking at the entire CoC, continuum of care in Contra Costa, implementing Housing First at the systems level means that all programs, including shelter, services, and housing, have lower barriers so that everyone can access the programs that they need to be housed and to be successful. We are prioritizing the most vulnerable populations. So that includes those with complex service needs, disabilities, mental health issues, active substance use issues. And those folks are all prioritized for and admitted to shelter and housing programs. We are also at the system level having housing-focused engagement that really happens right at the start. So every conversation and every touch point really incorporates housing and services discussion. This also means that programs are engaging in evidence-based practices such as harm reduction, trauma-informed
She just sent you an update.
care, motivational interviewing, and also other evidence-based approaches. And it also means that we're recognizing that services are client-focused and voluntary. So really working on helping people engage with what is best for them at that moment and highlighting client choice and voice. And it's also really important to recognize is that we think about serving people with higher needs. There may be a need also to increase supportive services. So again, having that really client-focused effort where we're really meeting clients where they are and providing the services that are best for them at that time. So we can go to the next slide, please. So if you are a case manager or a program manager designing a program, these are really the principles underlying this work, the housing first elements at the program level. So it means that program policies and practices, so in other words, the daily staff activities, should really align with each other and with system level housing first practices. So that what this means is that policies and staff use language that reflect that participants are treated with dignity and respect, that they optimize autonomy and independence among participants in making their own life choices, that they affirm participation in services as voluntary and self-initiated. So they are not a prerequisite for participating in a housing program. And also that they really reinforce that sobriety, income, having a clean criminal record or a clear conviction history are not required for entering a housing program. It's also at the program level, housing first means that staff are trained on best practices. So similar to what we had talked about earlier in terms of harm reduction, trauma-informed care, and other evidence-based approaches. And then also that it reflects the program's commitment to increasing the supportive services to ensure that barriers to entry and to maintaining participation in the program are low. It's also, like I said, that it's very important that a lack of sobriety or any sort of behavioral issues should not be a barrier to program entry on their own. It's going to really be dependent on the specific behavior. So for example, if there's violent behavior, that's going to be a different kind of requirement than having, for example, a mental health challenge. And it will, housing first principles means that people can be allowed to return if they so choose at a time when they are able. And we recognize, of course, that this is challenging for participants and for programs. So today we're going to be really looking at some of the most common challenges and how to address them, and also be emphasizing how to incorporate these principles into the programs themselves. So with that brief overview, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Eli, and he's going to be talking about some common barriers to program enrollment.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. And Michelle, I'm going to pass back the waiting room management to you. Hi, everyone. As Michelle said, I'm going to be helping us have a discussion around to start with some barriers to enrolling in projects that we sometimes see. And we're going to have a conversation about what are our pre-enrollment requirements and are they all actually requirements? And then we're going to, later in the second half of the training, we're going to be talking about, okay, what else makes housing first hard? Because we know that you all have incredibly challenging jobs. And we want to talk about the hard part. So that's going to be the bulk of the training, the second half of the training. Before we do that, I just want to do a quick check-in. So everybody get ready to type in the chat. It's going to be really easy. Just give me from a 1 to a 5, how excited are you to be doing a Housing First training with us, your fun home-based folks, to see our faces and to hear our voices for the next 2 hours. Give me a 1, you're a little bit excited, to a 5, you're super excited. How excited are you? Just check in the chat. All right, we've got a good variation. I'm feeling a, hey, I saw a 7 in there. Excellent, I love the vibe. Cool. All right, great. And that also tells me that most folks have found the chat. We're all in our Zoom world, Zoom space. So I'm going to be asking you to check in at a couple points through the training in the chat. And I'm excited that you're excited. Let's see. So this first piece, we're going to be talking about the barriers that exist, right? Sometimes because they have to, sometimes because they just do, to getting folks enrolled in the various programs that you all work in. And Primarily, when I'm thinking of barriers in this presentation, I'm thinking of the documentation that you all are collecting from folks before you can enroll them in your project. And I want us to think about that like pre-enrollment requirements, pre-enrollment documentation in two buckets. The first being the stuff that is annoying and is a barrier, but is necessary, because in order to provide this housing, these services, this shelter, we have to have funding. And our funder says there are eligibility criteria and you have to document them, right? Or we have this building and the building is right next to a school. So there are certain legal restrictions on, unfortunately, on who can live in that building, or what have you, right? Talking about requirements that are set by the funding or set by law, so that literally the program, you as providers, organizations, agencies, can't do anything about that, right? That's one bucket. The other bucket is pretty much everything else. This is stuff that you might want to collect from folks because you know that a landlord or a property manager is going to want to see it, but you don't necessarily have to collect it in order for that person to be eligible or enrollable into your project. This is stuff that you know down the line you're going to need to support service provision, right? In order to help someone assess their barriers to housing, you very well may want to work with them to run a credit report or do a background check that includes their, history with involvement in the criminal legal system, criminal background check. You may want to try to pull together identity documentation to confirm, social security cards, all of that stuff if clients have them. But are those things necessary for enrollment in your project? Or is it stuff that is going to help the person be able to get into housing, be able to get a job, be able to address those housing barriers, right? And how much can we separate those two things? So I'm going to illustrate this with an example. It's a very specific example specific to the CoC program funding stream. And I know that not all of you work with the CoC program funding stream, but illustrations are often helpful for human brains. So in the CoC program context, if your project just gets CoC funding and that's the only requirement you need to worry about, for example, the only required documentation before you enroll someone is documentation of eligibility, which for the most part is documentation of homelessness. And for permanent supportive housing, there's also a requirement that you document disability. For some projects, it's chronic homelessness instead of homelessness, but it's all about that core eligibility. And then for very specific CoC funded projects, specifically CoC funded permanent supportive housing that is operated by or passed through a local government, those projects also have to verify citizenship or immigration status. Otherwise, nothing else is required. Great question in the chat. What is documentation of homelessness? For CoC program funding, there's a very specific documentation requirement. It's an 1.5 or 2 hour training probably, but it is typically some sort of record from a shelter or outreach person or from the unhoused person themselves that about where they were sleeping the night before or in the period before enrollment. And then for a CoC program participant, right, if you have that documentation of homelessness, you can enroll that person. And then maybe you might want to work with the person to run a background check or try to get an ID or assess their income or do a credit check, right? But none of those things are actually necessary in order to enroll a participant. So what this means practically is when you're getting a referral from coordinated entry and you're a CoC funded program and you're sort of seeing, okay, am I ready to accept this referral and enroll this person? How much do we need to establish? How much do we need to check before we enroll this person? The stuff in the green is the stuff you do have to check. The stuff in the blue is the stuff that you can enroll that participant and then try to figure these things out if you need them to support the participant later. This may look different for your particular project because you may have a different funding stream. You may have multiple funding streams, right? So the first step is knowing what's necessary and then knowing what is being collected for some other reason, what's being added, right? So the first question, the check-in I want to do in the chat is, do you know if you work with this sort of, intake or enrollment or figuring out who's going to be enrolled, which referrals are going to be accepted, if you work in that space at all? Just a quick yes or no, or a question mark or a thumbs up. Do you know which of those requirements you have, those documentation requirements or other things, are necessary and which you're asking for another reason? Just a quick check. And if you really don't want to put it in the chat, you just want to answer in your own head, that's okay too, but just take a minute to check in about that question, because that's the first step. Got to know which is necessary and which is not. Awesome. All right, so it looks like there's a lot of folks who, are pretty confident. Yeah, we know which ones are required and which ones are not. A couple of folks who aren't quite sure, and that might be because it's just not clear. It might be because it's not super your role. A lot of reasons you might not know that. Okay, but it's a good practice, sort of fairly regularly. Okay, yeah, great. So in some cases, some programs, yes, in some cases, no. Yeah. Say it's a good practice to check in on this as an organization or as a project. And not as regularly as quarterly maybe, but every few years, right? To come back to, okay, so what is our current practice? What are we asking for before we enroll someone? Why are we asking for each of these things? Can we say, okay, all of these things are necessary? Because what I'm going to put up as the goal, my goal would be the sort of most housing first aligned would be to get rid of as many of the unnecessary stuff as possible, because the necessary stuff is going to be annoying enough. It's going to be enough of a barrier, right? So a couple of other questions to think about, and if you want to share in the chat what your thoughts are on these questions for your projects, please feel free to do that. But are there ways that you could lower those requirements for your programs, right? For those of you who said, yes, I know which ones are necessary and which ones aren't, are there some requirements, some documents that you're asking for, some things you're checking before you enroll someone that you could maybe wait to do that? You could maybe get rid of those and enroll someone a little bit quicker and get them started in that housing planning a little quicker. And then what concerns would you have about changing those pre-enrollment requirements, right? So if something's not absolutely necessary by your funding stream, but you're asking for it now, and you think it's really important to keep asking it why, right? What would be your concerns about removing some of those unnecessary pre-enrollment requirements? So feel free to share in the chat as you're thinking through that, right? Does it seem like, from what you know of your projects, are there places that you could lower some barriers? And do you have concerns that you're thinking about around lowering those barriers? I'm picturing you all diligently typing a focused paragraph of response to this, and that takes a minute, I know, to formulate your responses. If you'd also want to, if you're if talking out loud is easier and quicker for you, and you want to put your hand up and speak on this point, really want to have a sharing of your all's thoughts as a community. Yeah, okay, so I'm seeing that for some folks right now, it's just the referral from coordinated entry. Yeah. I'm seeing birth certificates can be challenging. Does anybody have a program or project or resource where you have to collect a birth certificate before you enroll someone? Mhm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm seeing a concern might be that if different providers of the same category of program have different requirements, even if they're trying to, each one is trying to lower barriers as much as possible, that could become confusing. That makes a lot of sense, right? If you have a couple of different rapid rehousing programs, excuse me, or PSH programs, and they have different funding streams, so different requirements, it can get confusing to make things different. So, right, there is a certain sort of efficiency and standardization saying, okay, well, we have to collect this for this project, but so let's collect it for all the projects. That does make sense. I would say that thinking about strategic uses of funding, right? One example I can think of is you might have some projects that can serve people who are undocumented and some projects that can't. And so that would be a really, really compelling good reason to not have that consistent collection of proof of citizenship or immigration status across the board, because you want to be able, like, you only have this one place where you can serve people who don't have that documentation. So I think there are also compelling reasons to have things be different and harder, because you want to find those pockets where, you know, this is the funding stream where we can serve people who can't meet this barrier, who don't have this piece of documentation. It's interesting. I'm seeing that you're hearing, you know, some places have a vaccine requirement. I'd be interested to hear how folks are addressing that, right? And like for site-based projects, for congregate style projects, shelters, transitional housing, are there state or local requirements you're dealing with? And, you know, what are folks doing with the COVID vaccinations? That's an interesting thread. Yeah. Yeah. Mm, interesting. So there are some local requirements for shelters around COVID. Yeah, so I'm also seeing that there might be some different opinions within organizations about what is required and what is not, right? So some people in an organization might think, well, of course we have to collect a birth certificate. Of course we have to collect an identity documentation, an ID, because otherwise how do we know we're serving the right person? Which again, also does make sense, but you know, I think that's where this type of training, making sure everybody gets this communication also at the agency level and the project level of, okay, this is the specific requirements for this project. The last thing you were working on, you had to collect ID or social security card. For this project, we don't have to. So that's one thing, less thing on your list. Yeah. Okay. Well, for time, we're gonna move on to seen a really great activity in the chat. So just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Oh, interesting. What type of homeless services program would need more than a photo ID in regard to personal identification? Yeah. I would say a lot of the homeless funding streams I'm familiar with don't actually require a photo ID at all, or any kind of personal identification from the funding stream itself. There may be some that do. I think where the identification often comes in for the funding stream requirements themselves, it's around citizenship status or immigration status, where it's the identity, the photo ID is not the it's not the identification per se that's the thing. It's establishing that someone is eligible for a certain federal funding stream because of their immigration status. But if other folks know about other photo ID requirements, put them in the chat. Okay, great. So that's, I think we're going to move forward, but that conversation y'all are having in the chat is, I think, something that is often worth taking back to an organization, to a team that you work with, to ask these questions. Do we know as a team what's required, what's necessary, and what we're asking for other reasons? And are there ways we can lower those pre-enrollment requirements to make our jobs easier and also to enroll the clients more quickly? And then discuss those concerns that y'all have. Like, why are you collecting this thing? Is there some other way you can get at what you're trying to get at with that? Any questions before we move on? Okay. Because we're moving on to the real fun stuff, what we're calling common housing first challenges. So we're talking about common challenges. I want to give a little bit of background on the source for this particular list of common challenges. These are challenges that we have heard through delivering this training, prepping for this training, asking for folks to, in various communities, to identify, when you're doing housing first, real talk, why is it hard? Like, what are the things you come up against where you're feeling like, I want to serve every person that gets referred to us, and we're trying to do that, but how do we do that when someone has no income and is coming to our case management meetings high and, like, you know, it doesn't qualify for disability benefits because their application got rejected, right? All of these really complicated barriers. We know that there are a lot of other really tough challenges, so feel free to raise those when we get to the discussion piece. But these are the ones that we've accumulated as our list. I also want to just make a quick language note. I intended to fix this on the slide, and I noticed that I didn't before showing it. But I'm going to be talking about people who are on the sex offense registry, as opposed to using the terms on the slide, registered or convicted sex offenders, because that is more pertinent to the actual real life experience that we're looking at. It's being on the registry that is the barrier. Okay, so the challenges we're going to look at are serving clients that have maybe complex or severe mental health, behavioral health challenges. Thinking, you know, the more severe, serious mental illness, dual diagnosis, things like that, ongoing and problematic substance use that's really interfering with a person's stability. Serving clients with very low or no income, right? We know that especially in high cost areas, that's a really significant barrier and can sometimes take a long time to overcome if it's even something that there are resources to address. Serving people who are on the sex offense registry, for sure. That is a intentionally legally created barrier in some cases to accessing housing. Reluctance of landlords to rent to folks. We hear this all the time. We have landlords that know us and are familiar, but they only have so many units, and we constantly have to be finding landlords. And it's hard to get landlords to consider renting to the folks that we work with. We also hear a lot about challenges in shelters, and we're going to talk specifically about those shelter-based challenges. A low barrier shelter can have some different, it serves a different purpose in the system, and so it can have some different challenges to low barrier housing programs. In the chat, I'm seeing credit, right? Poor credit, and how challenging, how common that is, and how challenging that can be to address, for sure. History, issues with rental history, evictions. Yep. Another common challenge that does come up a lot but hasn't made it in our slide deck yet is immigration status. I think that can be a huge barrier. And again, folks who are undocumented don't, like, those are intentional barriers that are created by our legal structures, right? And so that can be really challenging. Pets, experience of domestic violence. Yeah, Wanda, I'd love to see in the chat if you could share how DV plays in as a barrier. A little bit more about that. Clients who don't hold a W-2 or work under the table. Also clients who are not using a bank account. Yeah, folks who just aren't tied into that legal financial system that we have, for sure. So I'm going to dig in a little bit more to each of those pieces that were listed. And I'm going to start by going over sort of what we hear about the challenge and then reframe the challenge a little bit, right? And I know that this is likely not going to be new to a lot of you. I'm not trying to tell you that you don't know how to do your job, for sure. But I think it can be helpful to intentionally think about these things sort of abstractly and do the practice, right, of reframing. Okay, so in your work, you're coming across this barrier a lot. That's incredibly frustrating, and you're often very tired, I imagine. And so I'm gonna take this moment where we're all taking this break to sit on Zoom and do a training to talk about the challenge and then flip it, right? What is the way we have to be thinking about this to have any chance of overcoming it? So clients with severe mental illness, behavioral health challenges, often that comes along with behaviors, right? As human beings with severe mental illness or behavioral health challenges, behaviors can come up that can threaten someone's housing stability, that could potentially lead to eviction, and that can make it difficult for folks to engage with programs. So this means, what does this mean for us? It means that service plans, service agreements need to be flexible. They need to be focused on the needs of each individual, right? This is the basics of a client-centered service plan. And we need to be recognizing and preparing for, in our programs and in our staffing, that certain clients at certain times are going to need a lot more support, that it could get intensive, right? And it could get intensive when you're not expecting it. It's a great practice to make sure that leases and service plans are separate, if that's possible in your project model. If it's possible for a person to continue receiving that case management, and even if they get evicted and you're going to help them find a new unit, that is a huge strength of a housing project in terms of housing first. I know that's not always possible because sometimes housing projects come with a particular site, and those are the units that you have. And if someone gets evicted, that's all you have, right? But where possible, having leases that are uncoupled from service plans just means that those challenging behaviors that can lead to eviction don't necessarily have to lead to project exit. Making sure that tenants have full, understand their rights and have, valid leases, and also that you're able to connect folks to legal assistance for tenants can be really important in this area, because a lot of those behaviors shouldn't result in eviction. They should result maybe in reasonable accommodations. Knowing how to connect folks to prevention support, and then of course the interpersonal aspect, right? You're building relationships with your clients, but also you're recognizing that your job is not their recovery, unless you are like a substance use treatment provider. But still, you are not responsible for any person's directly responsible for any person's mental health, for any person's behavior, for any person's substance use, right? That is not your personal responsibility. So really focusing on that sort of critical self-care, not in like I'm not telling you to take more bubble baths, but in having good boundaries, having good organizational approach to these types of things. Serving clients with low or no income. So individuals who present with low or no income are often seen as challenging cases, and they can be very challenging to they can face a lot of challenges in their search for housing and for stability, especially if there's a concern that 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 there are underlying challenges, right? It's not just the low or no income, it's why does this person have low or no income? Why is this person struggled to remain employed? Why has this person struggled to have access to income? Those challenges might be ongoing, right? And that can be a really big impediment to long-term housing stability. So our housing first approach encourages us to understand, right, each individual person's history. So figuring out what are those, like what is underlying that lack of income? Is it a temporary or episodic like crisis, right? Is there something else going on in someone's life? Like, is there a need for childcare, transportation, or medical care for another family member, right? Or is it a need for behavioral health services? Is it a need for accommodations at work? Is it a need for medical care? Is it, is this a participant who maybe employment is not going to be feasible for them in the near future, and there's a benefits applications and understanding that, right? I love that, Robert. Yeah. Money management skills, right? Understanding a budget, opening up a bank account, all of this stuff that could be going into that, the sort of economic instability, understanding which of those things are the barriers for the participant you're working with. I'm going to say making sure that folks are connected with housing authority vouchers, right? Even if that, I know in some communities that can feel frustrating because we know that there aren't enough housing authority vouchers in most communities. And so getting on those affordable housing wait lists can feel like, okay, I'm just signing my participant up for 3 years of a wait for nothing, but it does happen. And it's always worth finding those affordable housing lists. Making sure that you're sort of constantly figuring out those ways to connect to benefits, cash and non-cash benefits, that can increase someone's economic stability. Again, we know that those application benefits can be challenging. The systems can be challenging. SSI and SSDI in particular, we know that can be a long process. So getting those things started right away. And then talking about things like shared housing. It's not going to work for everyone, but if somebody can make it work, if someone can find people that they can live with, shared housing is one of the most, if not the most widely used strategies for making housing less expensive. It's something that I have used most of my life to make my housing affordable to me, living with roommates. Yeah, so I'm seeing, yeah, there's even more to this, right? Even if someone has a voucher, maybe their voucher has expired, maybe the vouchers won't cover what's affordable on the market. So the flip side of this low or no income barrier is the housing is really expensive barrier for sure. Yeah, and it does mean like you all are doing that creative problem solving. Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to get into like the next piece after I stop presenting these slides is we're going to look at in breakout rooms some very specific scenarios and challenges, one of which I believe does relate to income, and talk through like, okay, what are the options? What would you do in a real situation? What are those creative solutions that you're coming up with? Serving people who are on a sex offense registry. This is one of the historically most challenging populations that we hear about. And I want to call out that there have been some changes recently to the way the state of California sex offense registry works, and sort of how folks can go about getting certain offenses reclassified that can then lead to them being able to be removed from the registry. So yeah, let us know in the chat if y'all would like more information about that specifically. But knowing knowing what's available for particular participants, right? If you have someone, they're on the sex offense registry, knowing where to go for those resources about, okay, what's available to my client about, you know, maybe the getting a registry reclassified, getting it removed. Knowing where folks can live, right? If there are only a few places within a community where folks can go, if they're on the sex offense registry, knowing where those are doesn't create more, but it's important to know what already exists. Making sure that you have the connections and the resources and the people who know, right? Who are your legal services providers in this area? Who do you go to when you have a question about what's available for someone on the sex offense registry, what the restrictions are for employment, for housing, right? Who do you reach out to? Who are your sources? And making sure everybody in your team knows that. Yeah, I hope y'all are also following the chat because there's a lot of good thoughts and also a lot of sharing about challenges going on there. Talking about landlords' fears with housing first. So one of the things that we hear a lot is I need to be able to tell my landlord, the landlords I'm renting to, that the participants, that their tenants have to participate in services. I need to be able to tell them that the services are required because the landlords are really concerned. And I think this is about that clear, open lines of communication. It's about having someone on the team, and maybe that's not the case manager directly, because the case manager sort of is responsible for that relationship with the client, but maybe it's someone else. If you're fortunate enough to have a housing navigator or a housing specialist or some other staff person identified to do those landlord relationships, that can be really helpful to separate those responsibilities. And then doing that ongoing landlord relationship work of knowing that, like, making sure they know someone is going to show up, right? We're not requiring folks to participate in services, but if you're having an issue with a tenant and you think we can help, here's a contact number. And you know, finding ways for landlords to talk to each other can be helpful. Not in every situation, but we've seen folks have success with things like landlord groups. And then just making sure you're all doing this, but checking in with the tenant to make sure that they understand the importance of a relationship with the landlord and strategies to support that. Marvel, thanks for calling out the housing locators. Yeah, and I do recognize that for some folks, case managers are doing that housing location. They are building those relationships with landlords. And that can be additionally challenging, because if you're responsible both to, like, you need to be there for the tenant and you also need to be there for the landlord, that can become complicated. As a case manager, what do you do about a client who will not register for the sex offense registry but is required to? It's a great question. I would
hello.
say, oh, hey.
I actually had an issue recently with a client who was registered but had issues with registering, and then also letting us know about the situation. So it was very challenging. But I'm finding a lot of clients who are 290 registers. The laws are changing. However, it's such a gray area because they all don't fit in the same boat. Like they just don't. And we have no way of knowing a person's circumstances on how they got that way, or how they got it registered, or whatever the case may be. So we don't have their case in front of us or anything. So that area is really difficult to house. It's not impossible, but it is difficult. And I just wish that the laws would change to put people in separate categories versus all in one category. You know what I mean? So yeah. It's really, really hard. It really is, because everybody does deserve they get housed, whether they are 290 or not. they still deserve to get housed, but it is such a gray area. It really is for all programs.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure. And we'll definitely send, this is again, a whole separate training topic potentially. So we didn't include that in this training, but we can follow up with links to resources about the recent changes about the California registry for sure.
Please send it to my email. I would love to see that personally
Awesome.
myself, because it's hard.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, and definitely, like, if your breakout group really wants to run with this, facilitators of the breakouts, like, I think consider being a little flexible with the topics if folks really want to talk about this in a similar way instead of the scenarios we have. But we can talk about that a little more in advance of the activity. Jason, I'm going to get to you in 1 second. I want to address the question in the chat. So as a case manager, what do you do about a client who will not register as on the sex offense registry, but is required to? I think my question in response to that is, what is your role as the case manager, right? Not a probation or parole officer. You're not responsible to the state of California for that, right? You're responsible to the client for identifying their housing barriers. If you're concerned that that might become a legal issue for them and a barrier to housing and might get them, incarcerated or back in the legal system in some way, something to talk to them about. But it's a conversation to have. It's outlining for them resources. If you're mandated, I'm less familiar with the mandated reporting laws. So I'm not going to speak to whether that is something that you are mandated to report. But I think in general, it's your role is to figure out how is this a barrier to this participant getting housing and remaining stable in housing. Go ahead, JC.
Hi, yes, this has been a really, what's the word? Yeah, a lot of the gray area piece is there, but it's very possible. We've housed folks with the registry, and it's a very tedious process, but I believe in any slow process is progress, right? I'm just sharing my thoughts on the success to housing our registered folks is the relationship and response with the case managers and the housing locators, because the landlords, they feel more assured when they know that there's somebody that they can contact to respond to. There's some that have been registered that have been successfully housed and they've maintained their rehabilitation. And then there's some that we've supported, especially Marvell, where they just get back into the swing of things of what they're accustomed to. But I believe that the constant relationship and response, not just with the landlord, but also the partner, and holding them true to there are consequences behind every behavior. And as a result of this behavior, this is what we're coming against. So, but also building that relationship with the partner and educating them to understand the why, not just the slap on the hand, but helping them understand the why. And Marvell had a partner like this, and he had to continuously speak with that individual. But again, there are possibilities in housing our registered folks.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, so there's a question in the chat, are we legally responsible to tell the landlords if the prospective tenant or the tenant is on the sex offense registry? And I am not going to be giving any specific legal advice about any situations that you all are in, because we don't know the specific situations. But I would say generally, again, think about what is your role, right? Mandated reporting doesn't mandate reporting to landlords. Can you, are you responsible for protecting the privacy of your client, the confidentiality of that information? Likely you are. So maybe a flip of that question is, are you allowed to tell the landlord that the tenant is on the sex offense registry? It's likely that you shouldn't be revealing that information, that you have a legal responsibility or an ethical responsibility to protect it. And like, again, the specific situations that you're in, I know that sometimes you all are the landlord, sometimes you're talking to the client about what should I disclose and what do I have to disclose on a rental application, right? Those are, so if you're talking to the client about do they have a responsibility to tell the landlord, right? That gets into, you know, what types of criminal offenses and what types of sex offense registrations need to be reported to landlords on rental application agreements, which again, I don't have those materials in front of me at the moment. Cool. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for, I mean, keep sharing those challenges. We know that fires in units are something that come up a lot, for sure. Okay. Last thing, before we wrap up the presenting part, we're going to wrap this up, then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and do some more discussion, more breakout problem solving conversations. The last thing we want to talk about is shelters. So we know that emergency shelter like just the structure and the purpose of a shelter is different from a lot of housing programs. We know that it can be challenging with everything that a shelter is trying to do and with traditional staffing structures for shelters. When a shelter is trying to take on that case management, housing search, service provision area, right? Sometimes shelters have been doing that forever. Sometimes that's a transition into a new role. So when folks won't participate in the housing search, in the case management, in a shelter setting where you may not have as much time or as much like someone's in a shelter for shelter, they haven't elected to go to shelter necessarily because they want to do a housing search. Whereas a housing program, there is at least that initial buy-in of everybody's goal is the housing. So again, reminding yourselves, like staying in the mindset of you are not ultimately responsible for any other person's life, right? You are responsible for the engagement that you're doing. You're responsible for showing up and you know, doing your part to build that relationship. That, you know, it can be really important, especially when your resources are limited, to help someone as a problem-solving thought partner to identify what other resources are available to them. Sometimes people don't have any, but if someone does have personal relationships, if someone does have a network of support, and it's not just you as project staff, that can be a useful conversation to have. And then keeping the planning, you know, short term, keeping it small, keeping it achievable, and just trying to take that next step so that it doesn't get overwhelming. Okay. Thank you all for the active participation in the chat. I really appreciate that. It makes me feel like I'm not just talking to the void. And Michelle, are we going for a 10-minute break? Is that what we planned for? Remind me.
We do have time, yeah, we have time for a 9-minute break.
A 9-minute break. Well, folks, we're going to go for a 9-minute break. I really encourage you all, we're going to come back at 2:10, so that will be our time to return. I encourage you all to take deep breaths. If you standing up is supportive for your body, stand up, move around, look at a tree, drink some tea, and then we'll be back at 2:10. Welcome back to the training, everyone. I trust and believe that you didn't all just do email and work during your break and that you took a break. And as I mentioned, the next piece of this training is some work, right? It's some practice. It's some talking and thinking about. So for some specific hypothetical challenges that we've written up, how would we address this? And I'm going to pass to Michelle in a second to set up the breakouts, but I'm such an enthusiastic supporter of practice, because it's like we do it for these trainings. I do it for other parts of my job, and I've heard a lot about the benefit of doing practice for your all's job, because when you're in the moment, when you're trying to figure it out, there's so much pressure, and it feels like there's so much emotion riding on, how you're doing your job. So taking the opportunities of a low pressure environment to think through what can I do? How do I address this type of situation? So anyway, yay practice. And I'll pass to Michelle.
Great, thanks, Eli. So as Eli said, we are going to go into breakout rooms. We're actually going to have 5 different breakout groups so that we have a good number for discussion. And we're going to be presenting you with 2 different scenarios that are based on real life scenarios that we received and questions that we received, and give you all the opportunity to really discuss it. We will have facilitators in each room. So we will have some Eli and I will be facilitating, as well as our colleague Carly from Homebase, as well as Jamie Schechter and Shelby Ferguson from H3. But really it's about all of us, as Eli said, practicing. So the discussion leader, as I said, I just mentioned who those folks are. And then what we're going to be doing is we also encourage you to identify someone to keep a general record of what you all have discussed. Someone else to keep time, and someone who definitely can also be the discussion leader to report back to the group at the end. And we are going to be meeting for 30 minutes as breakout rooms. And so now I'm going to just go through the 2 scenarios. So we would encourage you to do about 15 minutes per scenario.
Yeah.
However, if you feel like, go ahead.
Sorry, just a note on the roles. Discussion leaders, meaning facilitators, you know who you are. If you feel like you can record and report out while you're facilitating, that's totally fine. It's really if you want to ask for some support from the folks in the room, please feel free to do that and get a volunteer for the recording. When we do a share out, we're happy to hear from anybody in the group, but we're going to be calling on the facilitators to be ready to report out, if it makes sense. Sorry, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks. So what we're going to do now is share the scenarios with you, and then we're going to encourage you to spend about half the time on each one. However, if you find yourselves going through them and realizing this isn't even a problem for us, we have the perfect solution, whatever, you don't take as much time on it. There's been so much robust conversation in the chat. We also encourage you to, if you find that there is a different Housing First challenge that you feel like would be more beneficial for you to all problem solve, we also encourage you to talk about those things. But here are the scenarios, okay? So scenario number 1, the Housing First challenge is related to having low or no income. So Sophia and her 2 children are participants in your housing program. Sophia is an eager and willing participant, but you know that based on her children's needs and her own employment history, Sophia will never be able to afford rent in the area on her own. What do you do? So that's scenario number 1. And now we're going to go to scenario number 2. And this is related to challenges around a participant's behavioral health profile. So you run a permanent supportive housing program. 1 month ago, you received a referral for Alex, who has a history of substance use. Since arriving, Alex has refused to meet with their case manager or cooperate with the process overall. And based on behavior and appearance, it also appears that Alex has relapsed and is using alcohol and methamphetamine on a regular basis. This weekend, there was a small kitchen fire in Alex's unit, and when staff arrived to assist them, Alex appeared to be under the influence of methamphetamine. What do you do? And another wrinkle, what if there are other roommates in Alex's unit? So before we go to breakout rooms, does anyone have a question that you think would be best answered here in the big group? Great. Okay, and then we will now be going into our breakout rooms.
Yep. Okay, I'm just going to put both of those scenarios until we get our last breakout room back. There we go. Welcome back, everyone. Excellent work. We are going to do a brief share out. And I think we're going to I will call on the facilitator for each group. If somebody else, you decided in your group that somebody else wants to report out, that's totally fine. But I'm gonna, for clarity, I'm gonna call on the folks who were facilitating. So for room 1, Jamie, and sorry, before I let you go, brief highlights. We want to keep in mind that we do want to hear from all 5 of the groups. We have a good chunk of time, but 2 minutes per approximately. So pick scenario 1 or scenario 2 or a little bit of both, but whatever jumps out at you. Go ahead, Jamie Schechter.
So I'll try and do a little bit from each. With Sophia's case and her family, the first thing that came up was they did not like that the scenario said she would never be able to afford housing in the area. That felt very defeatist to the group. And so a lot of the things that we talked about were getting her connected to job training, subsidized daycare, what sort of shared housing opportunities there might be available, really making sure that she can tap into the network and resources available to her and her family to be able to get affordability, get financially stable, all that fun stuff. With Alex, we really tried to explore what sort of community supports that they might have and understand who they might previously have worked with, if they've got a relapse prevention plan, what the cause of the fire was it an accident, intentional, a defect within the unit, how that could have related to that kind of crisis situation, and see how open they might be to exploring treatment if they have in fact relapsed and want to look into getting into some sort of treatment program. And then if it's shared housing, really trying to have a conversation about how to meet the safety and sobriety needs of everyone in the household so that everybody can be accessing safe and stable housing. After we went through those 2 scenarios, we talked a little bit about having to deal with clients who get units, but for one reason or another, decline them. And so really trying to understand the conversations and setting expectations about you might not be getting that first perfect unit in the area that you identified with all the amenities you wanted, but it should be your first step in setting clear expectations that housing units should be accepted so that folks aren't waiting in line for them forever and ever. Anyone else from group 1 want to add? All right.
For group 2, Shelby was our facilitator. You're still muted, Shelby.
Oh, sorry. I'm having technical difficulties all day. I was in another breakout room audio, but my picture was in a different one. Anyways, we had a more robust conversation in probably scenario 1. So really everything that's already been said. Jamie said all the things that we talked about, but basically looking for affordable housing, wait lists. Is she open to living other places, including other places, even out of state, out of the area? Is that a potential? Is she limiting herself to, one city or one area? Also exploring other ideas like home match or IHSS as a potential employment opportunity, seeing if her kids need IHSS. So our group was thinking of really creative things. It's really impressed by. And then seeing if there's other resources she can tap into, like friends or family, other people that she could potentially stay with or connect with. Sources of income if she's a family, can she get connected to CalWorks? And then the crisis nursery was the last thing, just thinking of, out of the box resources that she could potentially tap into.
And then Carly, are you able to report out on your group?
Yes, we had a very enthusiastic group. Thanks, y'all. So we talked a little bit more about scenario 1 as well. And in addition to what's already been mentioned, we talked about landlord engagement and talked about different strategies for talking with landlords and what kind of barriers and gaps there may be in terms of landlord prejudices potentially. Joe also raised a really good point about income and how that ultimately sort of, this is one of the major things we're talking about in terms of access to resources is income and increasing that with her. And then in the second group or the second scenario, we had talked about meeting the client where they're at, and also sort of this point about harm reduction and how to bring that into this scenario as well, knowing that there might be some challenges with policies and procedures, and also knowing that meeting the client where they're at is really important with this. Is there anything anyone in my group would want to add to this? Either in the chat or ultimate in the large group.
You're doing wonderful.
Thanks, Orwell. Appreciate that. Y'all were great.
All right. Thanks, group 3. And Michelle, group 4.
Great. So it sounds like there's a lot of
Okay.
overlapping themes here. So for the scenario 1, yeah, we were talking a lot about supporting Sophia in increasing her income, so getting her connected with CalWorks. And also a specific resource that was brought up was the Bay Area Crisis Nursery. So really ensuring that her kids would have access to basically emergency childcare while she's getting the support that she needs, and to basically try to help get her out of crisis and know that her kids are well cared for during that time. So yeah, it was a lot of focus on stability and income, and also supporting the kids. And then in terms of the second scenario, we spent actually a fair amount of time talking about how to support the client and also maintaining the relationship with the landlord, and talking about in different scenarios, if it's a community landlord, or what if it's, that's going to be potentially different than, for example, if they're renting directly from a service provider. And so in terms of maintaining that relationship with the landlord in the community, while also supporting the participant to get access to the behavioral health supports that they would need. Anyone else from group 4 want to chime in? Do you think I'm missing anything? Great, that's all I have then.
Awesome. And I will take the share out for group 5. Though I will call out, I did not facilitate group 5. We had an amazing volunteer facilitator from our group who just, because I didn't get in right away, and they were already discussing when I got, it was a fantastic discussion. Thank you all so much. So what I heard was actually a lot of really good conversation about thinking of the different areas you might need to explore and you get more information about. So what exactly are the children's needs? What are the other what are the potential sources of support and income, right? Is child support an option? Does Sophia have family connections, or is that something that she's lost? Is there a father in the picture at all, and in what way? And then specific resources that were called out, the regional center, which I believe is the East Bay Regional Center, which provides supports for folks with developmental disabilities and their families. Talked about various options for sources of income, benefits, and then CalWorks. Also talked about having just a frank conversation with Sophia about cost of living in the area, and is Sophia open to looking at another area? Are there reasons why it's important for her to remain here, or for her kids to remain here? And that, which also noted that this could get even more complex if Sophia and or her children are undocumented. A bunch of other stuff, but just trying to give highlights. And then for scenario 2, yeah, talked about, how small is the fire? That's a relevant thing we want to take into account. The response and the intervention might be different based on the type of unit where the client lives. Are there other, is it a high density building? Are there other people around? Are there roommates or not? How do they feel about that? Is there, a need to like sort of assessing, is there a need to move this person to a different situation with a higher level of care? So we had a couple folks who were able to draw on their personal experiences with this. It sounds like this is not an uncommon situation, a fire in a unit. And, maybe this could be part of an indication that someone needs boarding care or a similar type of care. Or it could have been an accident and somebody needs to be taught how to use an oven, right? But also brought it back to what's contributing to the relapse. Are there significant life situation that's happened? Does this person have a support system? Is this person interested in or connected with substance use treatment? And what's Alex's health situation connected to the substance use? So a lot of good conversation there. Anything else from my group you want to add?
Well, I know the one thing that, like I spoke of, is having them to be, as ourselves, very transparent and honest, because without the honesty, we don't know how to direct the help. So they have to be honest with everything and transparent so that we know where to go and how to lead them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about like that it's people have to feel comfortable being honest, right? And so you have to like make sure that you're building that relationship so that people can be honest for sure. Yeah. Go ahead, Matthew.
The landlords, they do background checks. They will find something with arson. They will find anything that crops up. If they're not honest with it, it's going to ding them, and they're going to lose about the $40 for the background check fee that they had. Happened to me and my clients a couple times because they weren't honest about their past.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to our screen share really briefly and before we wrap up, because believe it or not, it's almost time to wrap up. I just want to make sure you have our email address up. Oh, goodness, come on. My screen share is not working. So we're going to close out by just thanking you so much for your time and for your great work and engagement with this. And again, another thank you for putting the email in the chat. I want to another acknowledgement that like we know that this is the work that you all do every day. And as Jamie said at the beginning, refreshers are important. Housing first is a hugely important thing. And we wanted to take this time and create this space for you all to talk about the things that make it hard, right? We also want to be transparent and have honest conversations. Housing first is important. It works and it has the highest likelihood of having the best outcomes for the most number of people. And we know that housing is hard. There are a lot of real challenges and we never want to ignore that. So the recording of this training will be shared and posted on the website. And as we mentioned, we'll also try to link you all to some just basic informational materials about changes to the California Sex Offense Registry. And anything else that you want to add, Jamie or Michelle?
I'm just going to add, Shelby put it in the chat, but I'll put it in again. We actually did a training about registrants on the 290 registrants and other folks with criminal histories, criminal backgrounds. And so we'll put that, I'm going to put that link again in the chat so that you have access to that. But we did have a whole training about that maybe 6 months ago.
Perfect. That's perfect. And oh yes, and also I want to call out, so Jamie put in the chat a link to a post-training survey. Please and thank you for clicking on that link now so you get to the survey and fill it out. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.